welcome to Broken Entertainment. So today we are going to cover, for the first time here on the channel, books that have fundamentally changed or dramatically impacted their genre or publishing in general or reading. And we're starting with not one of my favorite books or book series, Harry Potter. Now, some background first for me. I grew up sooner than Harry Potter came out, okay? So when Harry Potter came out, I'm reading Tolkien, I'm reading Pern, I'm reading these other books, right? And I've moved past that age where people got into Harry Potter initially. And I didn't really care about it. There was hype, but I'm like, okay, whatever. It's some kid in glasses riding around on a broom with a stick. Don't much care. That continued for the next however many years it's been since Harry Potter came out. 20, since the movie came out. Longer for the books. And, my wife's a big Harry Potter fan, and so I've heard an audiobook or two here or there. I've seen a movie or two here or there, and it's just not really ever stuck for me. It's just one of those things. I don't think they're bad. I don't dislike the work. It ends, and I don't really feel compelled to pick up the next one, right? So it exists. And we've talked about that in our house some, and she has said this was my generation's Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, okay, and I kind of have had that in the back of my mind when I was getting ready to do this video, and it really struck me how Harry Potter is in this unique position that I don't know if we've ever seen it before, and I don't know when we're going to see it again. And it's what really propelled Harry Potter to ridiculous levels, where you have an incredibly dedicated fan base. You have people that have made a Quidditch league, of all things, for colleges. It's all over the place. And J.K. Rowling has made a zillion, billion, trillion dollars and can basically do whatever she wants for the rest of her life, and the life of her children, and the life of their children, and so on. And, she started out as a single mother without much money to rub together and writing these books in coffee shops. It's kind of where those of us who are seeking publication are in various forms. I write at lunch, at work. I write at home sometimes at night. I write in the car on the way on long road trips. You just write where you can and how you can and when you can, and that's what she did, and she made a zillion, trillion, billion dollars, and that's kind of everybody's dream a little bit, right? If we're being honest, that you publish your work and it gets stupidly popular, and you get movies made, and everybody knows who you are, and you have a lot of money, and that's kind of the author dream. Now, personally, I would certainly not turn any of those things down. My goal is to have well-read, published novels. That's kind of the first step, right? But how did we get here, and what exactly is here? Because it's not just a popular book series. It's not just a popular movie series. It's a fundamentally altering book series. The movies did not have that impact. But the books changed publishing, changed how authors were approaching writing and what they were writing. And that doesn't come around very often. And you have to say, how did these books about this wizard kid flying around on a broomstick who's like 12 years old doing in the first book is just kind of a goofy, interesting adventure for the most part. How did that turn into this? Well, part of it, if we're honest, is luck. And that's not going to be covered much in this article, but this article covers some great information, so we are going to get into it. But part of it is luck. Because if you talk to the Harry Potter fans, the hardcore people, the people that literally grew up with Harry Potter, the book hit right when you're starting, people who read and enjoy reading, right when you're starting to look for books to like. Not, you've grown past kind of the school, like, oh, read these. Oh, here's your first chapter book kind of stuff. And you're looking around and you're looking for your reading identity. And a lot of people were right at that age when this book came out. And Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone was aimed at them as a target audience. So it was a natural fit, and it was interesting. You look at the cover, and your mind goes, whoa, what's going on here? It kind of grabbed this whole generation of people, most of whom are now adults. It grabbed this whole generation of people, and the very, very interesting thing that happened after that was that it kept going. And the very, very interesting that happened in that regard is that the books grew up with the readers as much as the readers grew up with the books. So the first book is pretty light. And as the series goes on, it gets more complicated and darker and more grown up. At the same time, its readers are getting more complicated and more grown up. So that by the time they finish the last book in the series, they're right there at adult fiction. And maybe they've graduated high school. Maybe they're in college at that point. It depends where they were when they picked it up, right? I don't know the exact timeline on publication on these, but these people literally grew up with these books. They didn't grow up with it like some people grew up with Star Wars, right? There were 3 movies and they were awesome. It wasn't, there was one book and it was really cool and you just went back and read it. It kept going. And as it went, it got more complicated and more interesting, so that as its readers were looking for more complicated and interesting things, their favorite book series was doing that for them. So they didn't wander off. And it fundamentally altered publishing in dramatic ways. And it altered a lot more than just publication. And we're going to see that in this article. But it's really incredible. I don't know if it's repeatable. And I don't know if J.K. Rowling planned it that way. But it happened. And it changed things whether you like the books or not. Whether you like J.K. Rowling or not, it doesn't matter. Its impact is visible and obvious. So let's get into that impact, because this is on Vox, and it is there's other articles kind of like it, but this is really really interesting. Almost exactly 20 years ago, on September 1st, 1998, Scholastic published Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. First U.S. edition. Okay, so I was wrong about the timeline of the movies. The book was 20 years ago. Got it. Harry Potter has since become such an all-encompassing phenomenon that from a vantage point, it is hard to see the full scope of what it accomplished. It feels as though publishing fandom and children's literature and all of pop culture have always been the way we know them today, but Harry Potter changed the world. Now, I do believe this article goes a little too far in crediting Harry Potter for some of these things. I think a lot of things kind of happened all at once to give us modern fandom. And a lot of it was already there. So pretending it wasn't, and pretending that Harry Potter did it all of itself, it just doesn't work out. But I do believe it played a role. Author J.K. Rowling was an unknown single mom when she first got the idea for her story Stuck on a Train. Small UK children's press that ultimately took a chance on it undoubtedly couldn't have predicted it would have a measurable effect on everything it touched. Harry Potter made YA book-to-movie franchises into one of the biggest forces in pop culture. It changed the business model for publishing books for kids, and introduced an entire generation to the idea that it's possible to interact with the pop culture you love, to write about it and with it, to make music and art about it, and to build a business around it. So, that's where we're kind of stretching, because that stuff existed already. A lot of Harry Potter heads, or whatever they're called, that give this person in particular, that give this credit to Harry Potter, don't understand, didn't see these things because they weren't in their wheelhouse. Harry Potter's U.S. publication made it a bona fide phenomenon. Harry Potter did fine when it first emerged in the UK, winning a Smarties Award and garnering respectable sales for its publisher, Bloomsbury, but only started to approach phenomenon levels when Scholastic bought the U.S. publication rights for an astonishing $105,000, about 10 times more than the average foreign rights sale at the time. Arthur Levine, the Scholastic editor who acquired the books, had an excellent eye for British books that would work in the U.S., having already acquired the U.S. rights to Redwall and his Dark Materials. But even he didn't know Harry Potter would grow as big as it did. He just knew that he loved it and wanted to publish it. Scholastic President Barbara Marcus kept saying, editing is important. Kept saying, do you love it? And Arthur said yes, so we went for it. A Scholastic spokesperson recalled in 2002, would have been willing to go further than that if I had to, Levine said in 2007. $105,000 sale granted Harry Potter two things, a built-in publicity hook, and a big budget. The hook came from the press. Newspapers featured articles about the little English book that had garnered such a huge sale. Reviewers wanted to know what kind of book would justify that kind of money. It was a curiosity, and as such, it was a story. The budget came from Scholastic itself. Whenever a publisher acquires a book, it creates a budget for that book. That budget is structured so that elevating the numbers in one category means elevating the numbers in the next. If you're going to invest $105,000 in acquiring the book, you're also going to pour extra money into marketing, publicity, and production, so you have a reasonable chance of making that money back. Scholastic invested in a lovely hardcover design for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I'm sure most people are familiar with it. With a soon-to-be iconic cover, even though conventional wisdom of the time held that children's books only made money in paperback. It arranged for Harry Potter to be displayed on the front tables of bookstores, and for ads to appear in the right newspapers and magazines. In short, it gave the book many more resources that are typically afforded to the average debut novel from an unknown author, and that decision paid off. That is very true. So, a lot of people have this belief, if I go to traditional publishing, they'll do the marketing, they'll do all this stuff for me, and I'll just write it and focus on that. No. Most authors have to push their own book constantly. Whether they're self-published or not, it doesn't matter. That's one of the reasons when I decided to self-publish, I said, you know what? If I'm going to have to do the work anyway, I might as well own every step of the process. So Scholastic invested in a lovely hardcover. Oh, we already covered that. None of Scholastic's efforts would have mattered in the end if people who picked up the book hadn't loved it. That's what pulled Harry Potter out of the flash in the pan territory, elevated into a phenomenon that defined childhood for an entire generation. Why adults got so obsessed with Harry Potter books. 2012 study found that 55% of YA novels are bought by adults. I think it's kind of a wish fulfillment thing. In large part, that boom is courtesy of Harry Potter, which became a surprise crossover hit adored by both children and adults, which made it acceptable for adults to read books that are ostensibly for children. So, to touch on that with a real-life example, my wife grew up with Harry Potter. She loves it, and her mom also loves it and grew up reading it with her. So it's absolutely true. For some critics, that's a worrisome development, suggesting that adults are too dull and stupid to appreciate books actually written for adults. But there are plenty of reasons for a grown person to enjoy Harry Potter. If you're a critic and you believe those things, find a different line of work. Okay? Because you can't assume people are dumb because they like what they like. I don't get adults reading YA novels. I really don't, unless they grew up with it. But that doesn't make them dumb. And there's a lot of this kind of elitism in critic circles in general, but there's a lot of elitism in literary field in particular that already finds YA novels to be trash anyway, and will tell you that genre fiction is trash, and the only true novel art form is the literature, the literary art, the literary novel. Total nonsense. Books cover all types of genres and topics. People like what people like. It's just the way it is. Let people enjoy the books that they read, whatever they are. The Harry Potter books combine the intricate plotting of a mystery with the sweep and scope of epic fantasy. Pause. It could be my ignorance of the later novels, but I don't find this part to be true. I do think it definitely touches on fantasy, but epic fantasy is a whole different ballgame. Epic fantasy, you're talking about Stormlight Archive, you're talking about Game of Thrones, you're talking about these huge, sweeping novels covering massive amounts of plot territory and territory within the book. Harry Potter gets pretty big at the end, I know, but I don't think I'd qualify it as epic fantasy. Or touching on epic fantasy. I think it touches more on like a high fantasy. Just not epic fantasy. I don't know where exactly I would put it. But it doesn't feel, and that's not an insult to Harry Potter. I just don't think it quite reaches. People have a tendency to over-exaggerate with Harry Potter, and I think this is the case here. But their point is made. It certainly does touch on fantasy and character development of a classic boarding school narrative. The result is purely pleasurable to read at any age. Puzzle box mystery plotting keeps the pages turning propulsively forward. The fantastic mythology gives the world scope, magic, and joy. The boarding school structure makes the characters warm and familiar and charming. It also makes their eventual death for some and trauma for all deeply affecting. It's true that Rowling's prose is best described as workmanlike and competent. If the reason you read is solely to enjoy perfectly balanced and polished sentences, you may be best served elsewhere. There are a lot of people who really like high prose. I'm not one of them. I do enjoy it. I just don't really care. As long as something isn't objectively badly written, workmanlike is fine. Really. If you're an adult who can imagine reading for more than one reason, the pleasures of story, the joy of immersing yourself in another world, Harry Potter books become enormously appealing. Early on, the books were extremely controversial, and in many ways they still are. Part of what made Harry Potter such a literary phenomenon is that so many kids were reading the books despite an unprecedented number of attempts to get them to stop reading the books. Despite or because? They're all starting around 12 years old. Let's keep that in mind, okay? And a bunch of adults are going, "That's written by the Satan. Stop reading." And they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to read this tonight." Mm-hmm. Yep. Just put this book inside of another book. Oh, look, I'm reading something that's not Harry Potter. Wink and nudge. Some regions' pressure to censor the series was so high it led to lawsuits. In 2003, a judge ordered an Arkansas school district that had removed the books from schools due to promotion of the religion of witchcraft to return them. I've not read all of the books, but I wish that people who criticize books for things like that would know what they were talking about. There's clearly no witchcraft religion in Harry Potter. You can tell that from book 1. It's not hard. But, that doesn't matter anymore. Similar formal attempts at removal persisted into the latter half of the decade, and the books continued to rile up conservative religious leaders who warn of its demonic influence. Yeah. Witchcraft wasn't the only evil the books were accused of peddling. In 2007, after J.K. Rowling retroactively outed the powerful wizard Dumbledore as gay, the news prompted Christian scholars to declare the move nonsense, while queer fans were in turn angry that Rowling had done so little to make the queer subtext of Dumbledore's character overt during the time he was actually being written and alive. In recent years, Rowling has provoked controversy for her series' lack of diversity, for denying queer sexuality of characters, and blah, 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 blah. Bunch of Twitter shit nobody cares about. As far as the whole Dumbledore thing, I remember when that came out, I was like, that's dumb. I still think it's dumb. I think it's dumb because it's not in the text. And it doesn't matter to the character of Dumbledore and to how he influences Harry Potter and how he affects the plot. It's just thrown out there to like gain points, right? It's dumb. The rest of it, I don't care. Some people are very passionate about on both sides. I don't care enough about stuff said on social media at this point. It is what it is. If you don't like J.K. Rowling, you don't like J.K. Rowling. If you do like J.K. Rowling, you do like J.K. Rowling. I'm not going to get angry at you either way. So, it's a non-topic to me for the most part, so I've never covered it. All this controversy speaks not only to concerns that Rowling's work would negatively influence children, but to the reality that many of those children could grow up to be arguably even more progressive than the books they were growing up reading. Again, an overreach, okay? I don't think Harry Potter made people progressive. I think, in general, that society swings back and forth, right? And it had been on a conservative arc for a while, and it swung back. That's not new. That's not surprising. And it's got nothing to do with Harry Potter. It's not making large swaths of people progressives, okay? Just not how that worked. It's just one of those things. Sometimes they over-exaggerate because they really like it. I get it. Okay, so Harry Potter's popularity completely changed the publishing industry. The effects spilled over to Hollywood. Books made it possible to publish long works aimed at children. Prior to Harry Potter, the accepted wisdom was that kids didn't have the attention span to read long books. And anyway, the thinking went, kids weren't buying their own books. Their parents were paying for everything. They would never be willing to pay an extra $1 or $2 for a longer book with an extra printing and binding. That's why conventional wisdom is often dumb. But after Harry Potter became an unstoppable cultural force, it was clear that fans would keep buying the books no matter what. It started to expand. The last 4 volumes in the series are all doorstoppers that clock in at well over 700 pages. See, this is why when this person says, oh, it's like the scope of epic fantasy, and then they call 700 pages doorstoppers. 700 pages is long for a lot of genres. It is not long for epic fantasy. It is actually pretty short for epic fantasy. So, yeah, I'm quibbling over minor details, I know. But the whole epic fantasy thing just doesn't work for me, and it keeps coming back to that. So, publishers and children's writers took notice. Booklets found that middle grade novels expanded 115.5% between 2006 and 2016. That's enormous. And the decade in which Harry Potter novels were at their longest, they rose only 37.37% between 96 and 2006. Harry Potter made children's literature an unstoppable force. Before Harry Potter, children's literature was often considered an afterthought. Sales were falling. Children analysts would say wistfully, children just weren't reading. After Harry Potter, children's literature became a category full of mega sellers. In 2004, in the midst of the Harry Potter phenomenon, sales of non-Potter kid lit were increasing by 2% per year. Since then, the children's market as a whole has seen its sales increase by 52%. For comparison, the overall book market has gone up 33% since 2004. It's incredible. The Harry Potter generation likes to read for sure. Millennials read more than any other generation. Um, that's interesting, and I could do a whole other video on that, but we'll just leave it. Also create a cultural landscape in which books for children are major cultural forces and a go-to well of ideas for Hollywood. Movie studios scour the children's bestseller list for properties they can turn into the next Harry Potter, hence Twilight, The Hunger Games, The Divergent, and all the rest. Before Harry Potter, the YA book-to-movie franchise was not a cliche. It barely existed. It is now, and that's because the boy wizard and his friends transformed an entire industry. Harry Potter fandom also paved the way for the mainstreaming of fandom and geek culture. Harry Potter has a tremendously outsized cultural reach. A 2011 survey suggested a third of all American adults ages 18 to 34 at the time had read at least one of the books. I have not. But what really makes Harry Potter stand out is the way people loved and continue to love Harry Potter. First and foremost, the series helped make it cool to be a geek. This was already a thing. This was already an expanding force before and during Harry Potter. Harry Potter was a part of it, but it did not do it. You had a dramatic expansion of events that happened in this time period, including the release of the Star Wars prequel movies, which heightened Star Wars fandom, and you had other sources coming out. You had other people stepping forward saying they enjoyed this kind of thing. It's not all Harry Potter, but it definitely played a role. People generally didn't read the Harry Potter books in isolation. They wanted to talk about it with their friends and then find more friends who loved the books as much as they did. Pattern coincided with the rise of Web 2.0, as increasingly interactive and social internet. As more Harry Potter fans became more active online, they made discussion of YA fiction, fantasy, and science fiction seem commonplace. I think it's just because of the visibility of the internet. Okay, this was going on in the 70s and 80s too. People would write letters back and forth and to authors. So that was already an existent thing. It just became much more visible online. So it's still a pretty bold concept in the early 2000s. Geek culture was largely still underground, that's true. But it was expanding pretty quickly. Fantasy was seen mainly as an immature hobby. It still is. For instance, in 2003, critic A.S. Bryant's exortation of the Harry Potter and the Childish Adult claimed that adults like to regress when they read children's literature, but between Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings film adaptations and the emerging visibility of online Harry Potter fandom, it was increasingly difficult to ignore fantasy and science fiction as a driving force of culture, to write off fans of these genres as niche. By the time Twilight took over from Harry Potter as the reigning young adult phenomenon in 2005, the idea of a modern mainstream fandom coalescing around a major sci-fi fantasy series was well established and generally accepted. Harry Potter's fans' creativity is still being felt in the outside of the fandom. In early 2000s, Harry Potter fan forums, fan fiction, fan art archives, and email discussion groups exploded across the internet. Harry Potter conventions drew thousands of fans, and Harry Potter cosplay became a well-known sight at larger geek comic and Comic-Cons. These things existed for other franchises too. Around the same time, the Wizard Rock trend, shorthand rock, gained momentum as Harry Potter fans on YouTube formed a litany of music groups. That's slightly disturbing for me, but okay. The first one being Harry and the Potters, of course. Devoted to personifying and singing about various characters from the books, it was later joined by another totally unique to Harry Potter fan pursuit, Quidditch. In 2005, students at Vermont's Middlebury College created the first real-life Quidditch game, which went to spawn an international real-world college sport that almost no one has heard of. But it did. I've seen pictures of it. It's hard not to laugh because it kind of looks like handball, except everybody's running around with broomsticks between their legs. It's a little odd, but whatever. A number of Harry Potter fans also went on to make significant marks on mainstream culture. As a member of the University of Michigan theater troupe Star Kid, a young Darren Criss starred as Harry Potter in the viral YouTube video of Harry Potter musical. His popularity catapulted him into the role of Blaine on Glee and a career on Broadway. I was wondering who that was. Two longtime members of Harry Potter fandom, siblings John and Hank Green, now known more widely as the Vlogbrothers, got their start on YouTube during the site's relative infancy. It wasn't until Hank Green's song Accio Deathly Hallows went viral on the eve of the final Harry Potter books release that they became the true YouTube stars and industry success models they are today. And the list goes on. The author of the best-selling Mortal Instruments series first gained fame online as Cassandra Clare, author of the incredibly popular Harry Potter fanfic, the Draco Trilogy, and other Harry Potter fans, like fan convention organizer. Not new, but definitely spread as a result of Harry Potter. What made all of this possible, the industry transformed, the careers built, are the books themselves and the expansive and wondrous world they created. The Harry Potter series is a phenomenon, not just because it had good publicity and marketing budget, and not just because of the curiosity and controversy surrounding it made it appealing to the press. The Harry Potter series is a phenomenon because it tells the story that millions of people loved and introduced the world to an enormous and magical world that millions of people have dreamed of escaping into. So we're still talking about these books 20 years later, and why all of this matters. So that kind of covers a lot. But you saw the numbers in publishing. It's huge. You've seen the movies, right? Harry Potter, Twilight, Divergent, etc., etc., The Hunger Games. All of those came around, the Mortal Instruments, all this stuff comes around because of Harry Potter. And today, the YA market is so saturated with people trying to get published, it's insane. And it's because they're all chasing the Harry Potter dream. Harry Potter fundamentally altered publishing. It altered how publication companies approached these things. It altered how people accepted YA as a genre. And it altered how people perceived, at least in some degree, quote-unquote geek culture. It's a big deal. It's fundamentally altering. This changed the way it impacted YA and took it from a basically non-existent genre to publishing agents all over the place looking for the next J.K. Rowling and the next Harry Potter, and to Hollywood suddenly making all these movies and doing the same searching. It's the same level of impact that you see for other major series that we're going to talk about in this video series. But it's really hard to overstate its impact on publishing and readership more than anything. And on Hollywood. The fact that people literally grew with these books. As they grew older, their books grew older. As they looked for darker things, the books brought them darker things. It's the kind of thing, if you want to put it into a sports allegory, there are generational talents. And I don't know that J.K. Rowling qualifies herself as a generational talent, but this is a generational series where you may not see something quite like it for quite a while. You know, if you look at everything that followed it, they haven't had near the impact, and in fact, really arguably decreasing impact as they go along through YA. As YA becomes popular, but it becomes very, very shallow, where there's just books everywhere and nothing that particularly dominates anymore. But there are people trying to publish YA, there are people trying to find YA, there are people trying to make YA movies because, undeniably, of Harry Potter. It's pretty crazy, really. And again, I just don't see it happening again like that. That unique circumstance of people being captured as readers at an age of 12 and literally growing up with it. I can't think of another series of books that has ever done that before. When you think, or at least when I think of a lot of the fundamental book series, Lord of the Rings, for example, Game of Thrones, another example, The Wheel of Time, these series all hit adults. And they all stayed with adults. Not that younger people didn't read them, but that was the audience, and that's what it stayed with. Harry Potter hit kids. And by the time the book series was over, the kids that it hit were adults. Or getting close to it. And that's an incredible journey that is very unique to Harry Potter. And is, I believe, the fundamental reason, forgetting the fantasy, forgetting the boarding school narrative, all that, this is the fundamental reason that Harry Potter has such a tremendous impact, because it kept people going. And they literally grew up with it. And they have memories of it that you can't replicate. And whether I like it or not doesn't really matter. Because you can see the impact. And I wonder sometimes how many people out there actually can get into Harry Potter now versus the people that grew up with it. If you have feedback on that, I'd like to hear it, because I don't really know. And I'd like to hear what people think about that, especially if you are a Harry Potter fan. What do you think of all of this? Let me know in the comments down below. If you have a suggestion for another genre-defining or otherwise altering book, let me know in the comments down below. If you like the video, please hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. Ring the bell for notifications, and I will see you next time.